Hello there and welcome to my home. My name's Anthony James Donnelly and I thought I'd join the other celebrities that are out there and I would read you a bedtime story or just a story to fill the time while we're going through all these troubled times. So I'm going to be reading from one of my books, Charlie the Migrating Snail. I was going to be reading it on a mini tour of schools and libraries this year, but that's all been put on hold. So this is the next best thing. So I hope you enjoy it. So if you're sitting comfortably, I shall begin. Chapter 1. Snail Garden. Life was pretty much business as usual in the garden. All the snails went about their daily chores content in their work. They were happiest if the weather was not too hot and not too cold. There was protection from the birds, and there was plenty of juicy lettuce to munch on. Well, that is, most of the snails were. Charlie was different. He was young and curious. It was his continued questioning that made his friends nickname him Little Charlie Why, because he seemed far too small to have all these silly questions in his head. But his head was full of questions. A head full of questions that wanted answers. The new sun was rising in the morning sky as a cool summer breeze blew through the garden. Change was in the air. The sun rays reflected upon the dewdrops hanging on the moist grass. There was a bumper lettuce crop that year, and all the snails were busy harvesting the leaves ready for the coming winter. All the snails, that was, except Charlie. He had separated himself from the crowd. He wandered alone slowly in his favourite part of the garden, deep in thought. His parents had gone to great lengths to teach their little son to talk and come out of his shell more, and then regretted it. Hardly a day went by without Charlie asking another question. He wanted to know the answers to everything. Why were snails snails? Why was the sun warm when it shone? Why is there always more to learn? Why? At present, he was thinking about a recent event. Uncle Harry, his favourite uncle, had been out late in the heat of the afternoon, a thing snails should never do. Harry was busily minding his own business when all of a sudden that dangerous shadow that snails instinctively know all too well fell across him. Before he had time to react, the large blackbird had swooped. Its beak cracked through his shell like a bullet, and poor old Uncle Harry was carried off into the vast expanse of the sky, never to be seen again. Charlie stopped and looked up at the blanket of cloud that formed the ceiling of the garden. Somewhere up there was his favourite uncle. Only his memory remained in the minds of his relatives back in the confines of the garden. Charlie remembered the interesting tales of adventure he used to tell about his life. If Charlie had been picked on or bullied by the other snails, his stories would always cheer him up. Secretly, Charlie believed that Uncle Harry had just gone off on another special journey somewhere and would return any minute full of even more exciting tales to tell. Charlie's head was still a mass of questions. Why did the birds eat the snails? To him, his questioning was quite normal, and he couldn't understand why the others weren't interested. They all thought he was silly and disruptive to think of stupid things, especially when there was important work to be done. Even Charlie's parents didn't seem to understand his reason for questioning things. At first they thought his questions were harmless, but as time went on and his questions became harder to answer, Charlie became a nuisance. In the end, they just gave him the same answer. That's life, son. Frank, Charlie's father, was busy working with the other snails on the lettuce plantation as his son slowly wandered past in a daze of thought. Frank stopped briefly and looked down at his little son from the large lettuce leaf he was working on. Charlie stood staring out into space, his mind seemingly on nothing. "Charlie," called Frank, "will you come up here and give me a hand for a minute?" Charlie gave no answer. His mind was miles away. "Charlie!" He looked up at his father. "Oh no, thought Frank, seeing Charlie's expression, knowing what was coming next. Dad, began Charlie, why do all the snails work so hard? Son, we'd all love to just drift around like you, but there's important work to be done. Everyone else is happy to help except you, said Frank angrily. But why? Asked Charlie. Charlie had asked one question too many. He was not content to be just a snail like his parents and all the other snails in the garden. He wanted to know why. Why? But his father had had enough. This question was the last straw. If you really want to find all these stupid answers so much, then go off and find them for yourself. We're all far too busy working, snapped Frank. That was that. Charlie realised his father was right. He had outgrown the limitations of his parents and the garden. Now there was only one thing for it: take his father's advice and go off alone in search of all these wonderful answers. He certainly had plenty of room in his little shell to store them all up in. Perhaps somehow he would even grow for the experience. Maybe then, when he returned with all this knowledge, they would take more notice of him. He quickly packed up his shell, waved goodbye to everyone on the plantation, and headed off beyond the boundaries of the garden. The summer winds of change began to blow harder, giving him a little push on his way. He'd not gone far outside the garden when he felt rather hungry. He crawled inside his little shell and pulled out a juicy lettuce leaf to munch on. After a few small bites, he began to feel rather groggy. His little head span, thumping with a loud beat. He could sense something coming nearer, a rhythmic pounding, the sound of large footsteps coming closer. Being a snail, and notoriously slow at that, he knew he would not be able to flee to safety fast enough, especially as he felt so light-headed. He looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. But there was nothing, not even a crack in the pavement. The thumping of the shoes came closer and closer. He did the only thing left to do. He went inside to the safety of his little shell and prayed for the danger to pass. His head was spinning. His heart was pounding. He could hardly tell the difference between thumping shoes and him. The beating echoed round his tiny shell, louder and louder. In his dizzy head he pictured the enormous pair of shoes beating a path towards him. Two large soles, like huge hammers, thumping on the pavement. The pavement he clung to with fear. Nearer and nearer came the noise. He held on to the lettuce leaf for comfort as the noise reverberated inside his shell. The noise seemed to come from everywhere. Numb with fear, Charlie prayed. An age seemed to pass. Charlie listened. His heart was pumping louder than ever. He listened more closely. The hammering had stopped. He waited. Had they gone? As his heartbeat slowed, he couldn't hear anything. He cautiously emerged from his shell and looked around slowly. He couldn't see anything. The only sound was his deep, heavy breathing and his machine gun heart. Then the thought struck him. Slowly, very slowly, Charlie looked up. There, directly above him, was the shoe. It had come down right on top of him and stopped. No wonder he couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. He looked around and laughed with relief. He was so small that he fitted neatly underneath the instep of the shoe. Before he could blink, the large pair of feet pounded off again quickly, and Charlie was left alone again. His head was still spinning, but he thought for a moment how lucky he'd been. Being small wasn't so bad. His journey for answer had almost come to a very abrupt end. Being so small did have its advantages after all, he thought. The shock of this first encounter made him remember how hungry he was. So he munched some more on the delicious lettuce leaf. The more he ate, the drowsier he became. His little feelers started to wilt. His eyelids became heavy. and his curious little mind began to wander. He mused over this first experience. Sleepily he proclaimed it as a lucky omen and began to dream of all the exciting adventures that lay before him. All those fascinating people and places he would see. All those wonderful answers he would discover. The wind blew harder. His mind wandered further. Charlie clung harder to the lettuce leaf to stop it blowing away. He felt very weary. The wind became stronger. He slid back inside his little shell and slowly, very slowly, fell fast asleep. Stronger and stronger blew the wind. Little Charlie Snail just slept and dreamt. And I'll be reading you chapter 2 shortly. I hope you like that. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed chapter 1. Now let's crack on with chapter 2. Time flies when you're counting sheep. The wind finally stopped blowing and the morning sun shone harder and harder. Charlie was feeling very hot inside his shell. He slowly stretched out his tiny feelers, gave a very sleepy yawn and checked if the pavement was clear. The sight before him made him dart back inside his shell again with shock. He peeked out from under his shell again. Nothing outside was familiar. Everything had changed. Gone were the pavement and his little homeland. He was now in a strange new world. The lettuce leaf was the only thing that stayed the same. He released his grip on it and neatly packed it away again in case he felt hungry later. He was a little more awake now and he looked around more closely. He appeared to be in the middle of a large field full of long green grass that swayed rhythmically back and forth with the cooling breeze. The field was empty apart from a large brown and white cow and a fly. The fly was buzzing frantically around the cow. Occasionally the cow would swish her tail and the fly would buzz away again. Charlie watched with interest. Swish went the cow's tail again. "Excuse me, Mr. Fly," called Charlie. "Why do you keep buzzing around like that?" The fly hurried over to him. It would buzz around his head, stop, and then buzz off again to pester the cow. Can't stop, buzzed the fly. "Too much to do, too little time." "Moo," said the cow, swishing her tail. The cow was lazily chewing cud. The fly dodged her tail and flew back to bother Charlie. "But Mr. Fly," Charlie tried again, "you'll tire yourself out if you keep flying around like that." I'm a fly, he buzzed. "I haven't got time to chat, far too much to do, so little time." "But why are you so busy?" The fly huffed and puffed as he flew around Charlie and then back to the cow again. "Time might be a luxury to you, little fellow, but it certainly isn't to me. Do. I have far too much to do, so very little time." Charlie was very puzzled. This poor little fly seemed to just hop around forever, flying here, buzzing there, whizzing around, so busy. In fact, this silly little creature was making Charlie rather dizzy. And if there was one thing snails hated more than stale lettuce, it was being dizzy. "Will you just be still for a minute?" commanded Charlie. A minute, answered the fly, zooming past Charlie for the umpteenth time. "Do you have any idea how long that is? A whole minute? He must be mad." "Moo," said the cow again, and swished the fly away with her tail. Charlie looked at the lazy cow. She didn't seem to be the slightest bit bothered by this little insect. In fact, the cow didn't seem to be busy at all. "Mrs. Cow, you look like you've got time to talk to me about this silly little fly. Do you know why he keeps buzzing around so frantically?" "It's all right for her," buzzed the fly as he passed them both again. The cow slowly swished her tail and chewed some more grass. "The fly," began the cow, "is very busy. Yes, very busy." She chewed some more grass slowly, deep in thought, adding, "Flies are busy little things." "See, see," buzzed the fly. "Flies don't have much time, you see," chewed the cow. She swished her tail again as the fly tried to land on her back. "Time, time, oh, well, it wouldn't do for more time. You don't know what it's like," buzzed the fly as he flew away again. "Living under the constant pressure of time. Oh, what am I doing? I haven't got time to talk to you." Charlie looked at the two of them. The fly busily being busy, the cow not seeming to do anything. "What do you mean?" Charlie asked. The cow carried on chewing, swishing her tail. "It's no good asking her," said the fly, just managing to avoid yet another swish of the cow's tail. "She doesn't understand. Time doesn't mean anything to her." Indeed, the cow seemed to have all the time in the world. The poor fly, on the other hand, seemed to be doing things faster and faster in order to make more time. Charlie could hear the distant sound of deep clanking bells and bleating way off in the distance. The noise was getting louder. "You see," began the cow, "flies don't have very long to live. They have to keep busy." "Oh," said Charlie. "Isn't that terrible?" moaned the cow with a slight moo. "Personally, I think it's far too hot to be rushing around like that." Charlie had to agree. It was rather warm. He was still curious to know why the cow wasn't concerned about time. "So, Mrs. Cow, what do you do all day?" "Me?" began the cow slowly. "I'm a dairy cow." She chewed some more grass. "It's my job to produce much needed milk." She gave a happy moo, proud of what she was doing. "You can't rush making milk, you know. It spoils otherwise. It takes much chewing and lots of grass and lots more chewing." "I never have time to make milk," interrupted the fly, whizzing past again. "Far too busy for all that." It was becoming very, very warm. Charlie curled back inside his shell and pulled out the lettuce leaf to use it as shade from the deathly sun. "Oh, where has all the time gone?" buzzed the fly again, zooming past Charlie. "Moo," went the cow once more. A cool breeze began to blow. "Where does all the time go?" wondered Charlie, as he nestled under the shade of the cooling lettuce leaf. The fly reminded him that he too had much to do. His adventure had only just begun. So using the lettuce leaf as a parasol, he headed off once more in search of answers. The noise of clanking bells was becoming much louder. "Bah!" said the sheep, appearing before Charlie as if from nowhere. All of a sudden his path was blocked by a mass of bewildered sheep. As far as his little feelers could see, there were sheep running this way and that. Their helpless bleating was fast giving Charlie a headache, and headaches rated third after dizziness. The cow and the fly had now disappeared amidst this flock of sheep. One minute Charlie was getting ready to march off on another adventure. The next he was swamped in a forest of sheep's legs. Charlie held tight to his lettuce leaf and hoped not to be noticed. He had things to do. He cautiously slid past the flock of nervous legs. With much effort and weaving, he made his way through the mass of woolly legs and came upon a small clearing, where only a few stray sheep were grazing. Their bleating drifted off across the wind. Charlie knew he just had to keep going. If he was distracted, even for a minute, it could cost him valuable time, and he might end up like the poor fly, busily doing nothing. A young shepherd proudly mingled amongst his flock. They bleated respectfully to him as he wandered past and tapped them back into line with his crook. Looking down, he noticed Charlie marching along beneath the lettuce leaf. "What do we have here? A moving lettuce leaf?" the shepherd said, surprised to see something that wasn't a sheep. "Oh, it's a snail. Hello there, Mr. Snail. Charlie kept his head down, his mind and feelers clearly focused on where he was going. The shepherd boy bent down to Charlie and picked him up in his large hand. Hello, Mr. Snail. Curse this lettuce leaf. Charlie was distracted now. The least he could do was find something good from this meeting. Maybe Charlie could learn something from this young man. He quickly packed up the bright green leaf and looked up at the shepherd. Hello, he said. The shepherd beamed a sunshine smile down at Charlie, who paced slowly around the boy's palm. Charlie looked up at the young boy with a questioning glint in his feelers. Your flock looks lost and scared. They are, said the shepherd, masterfully surveying his flock. The sheep mingled around in the distance, bleating occasionally. Luckily for them, I'm here to lead and look after them. Every so often he lifted his crook and tapped a stray sheep back into line as he walked amongst them. These poor creatures have no idea where I'm leading them. They would be happy just to chew the grass here and have fun. They'd get eaten by the wolves or simply be lost without me. The shepherd rested back proudly on his crook. Charlie watched the flock milling around them both. Some were chewing the grass, some slept, some rolled around in the sweet pasture. Charlie looked up at the shepherd and asked, So, where are you leading them? I'm taking them to the market in town, he replied. There they will be sold. Some will be used for breeding, some will be sheared and their fleeces sold for wool, some will be sold and slaughtered to feed the villagers. That's what sheep are for. Charlie looked keenly at the shepherd and then glanced at the flock again. The sheep looked very content. They had no idea where they were being led, but they looked happy. They didn't seem to care what happened to them, or that some of them might be sold and killed for food. Somebody was leading them, and that seemed to be enough. It wasn't important to them right now where they were being led, as long as someone else was leading and looking after them. At least they didn't have to lead themselves. So, where is this town? Asked Charlie. The shepherd looked down at Charlie and then looked at the horizon. The town, began the shepherd. The town is out there. He pointed way off into the distance, adding, Somewhere. Somewhere? Inquired Charlie. You don't seem very sure. The shepherd paused. I'm not exactly. You mean you don't know where you're leading your flock? The shepherd looked sharply at Charlie. I know exactly where I'm leading them. I'm taking them to the market, he exclaimed indignantly. He paused again, concentrating on the distant horizon. He gave a long sigh. It's just, I'm not quite sure exactly where the town is, that's all. He sighed again as he looked at the flock he commanded. But look at them. They're happy. They don't know any better. They're happiest when they have food to eat and somebody to lead them. They don't want that responsibility. The young boy didn't care for Charlie's probing questions anymore. He set him down on the ground beside a small rock and wandered off amongst his flock once more. He tapped a few sheep back into line and led them off towards the market, wherever that was. Charlie watched the flock and the shepherd disappear as he slowly climbed up the grey rock. Once on the top, he tried to judge where he was. The sun shone down upon his slowly growing shell. He slipped back inside and pulled out the Judas lettuce leaf for shade. The sight of the leaf made him feel hungry again. Eating was something snails loved most of all, especially if the leaf was as moist and as inviting as this one. He took a couple of nibbles. The wind blew stronger. The shepherd and his flock were now totally out of sight, and as Charlie ate, he felt rather tired. His feelers drooped once more with fatigue. He pulled the lettuce parasol around him for shade, took a few more small bites, and drifted off to sleep. The sun shone stronger, the wind blew harder, and Charlie Snail drifted further off into a deep, deep, dreamy slumber. As the wind blew stronger, it caught the lettuce leaf and lifted it and its delicate cargo way up in the air. And the whole time, Charlie just slept and dreamt. And in a minute, I'll be back to read you chapter 3. I wonder if you can guess what happens to Charlie next. It's going to be exciting, I'm sure. Alright, see you in a bit. Welcome back. I hope you're enjoying the story so far. Now let's crack on with chapter 3 and find out what's going to happen to Charlie next. The Sultan and his Camels. Charlie awoke late. He had no idea how long he had been asleep, but as he stiffly crept out from under his shell, he gave a sleepy little yawn, stretched out his feelers, as was his habit in the morning, and looked around. He still clung tightly to the lettuce leaf, but he had no idea where he was. He blinked and looked around in awe. No longer was he in the lush green field. Instead, he found himself at the foot of a very large sand dune in the middle of a dry, sandy desert. All he could see for miles around was the vast, barren expanse of sand stretching out in every direction until it melted like butter into the horizon. It appeared totally empty. Empty apart from the strange noises coming from beyond the hill of sand. The morning sun had quickly driven all signs of tiredness from him. Spurred by his recent encounters and his increasing appetite for more answers, he had decided to investigate the curious sounds and discover the source of all the noise. He found it rather difficult crawling up the hot sand dune at first, but he eventually made it all the way to the very top. He was very hot and very sweaty and a little out of breath. He licked his salty feelers as he caught his breath and blinked as he looked down at the strange spectacle before him. He watched and wondered. There before him was a large group of people busily rushing around in the arid desert heat. One person was particularly noticeable because he was the only one not rushing around. He was very well dressed and relaxed upon plush silk cushions beneath the shelter of a cool white tent. The Sultan drank deeply from his golden goblet and watched his servants working. One group of servants were digging a large hole in the sand. Another tended to the many camels. The third group interested Charlie the most. They were dragging a huge silver pole towards the pit that the other servants were digging. The pole was pointed at one end and had a large oblong-shaped hole in the other. Charlie watched with interest, carefully crawling closer to the activity. After a time, the servants lifted up the pole and buried it, pointed end down, in the large pit, and filled the hole back in again. Now only the eyelet was showing out the ground. In the midday sun, it shone like a golden doorway, a portal to the heavens. Throughout this show, the Sultan had watched, eating a few ripe dates and drinking lavishly from his bejewelled golden goblet. Presently, the Sultan clapped his fat hands together loudly. The servants brought forth one of the camels. They led it up to the golden eyelet and began trying to push and pull it to make it go through the opening. The camel didn't seem to like this game and spat at the servants, flaring its nostrils wildly. The Sultan clapped his hands again, and the animal was led away in disgrace. Another camel appeared. The servants tried again. This camel didn't like the game either, and kicked its hooves violently in the air until it was led away like the first. Charlie was very puzzled. What on earth were they doing, he wondered, as he neared the Sultan's camp. Time and again he watched the servants bring a camel up to the eyelet, but none of the animals would walk through it. As the servants struggled with the last camel, the Sultan leapt up from his wealth of cushions in disgust. He violently shoved his servants to the ground and approached the camel. The poor poor animal snorted and spat, kicking its hooves wildly in the air. This didn't deter the Sultan. In one smooth movement, he drew his large, ornate sabre from its hilt and swung at the poor creature, chopping it in half. Clapping his hands once more, he waved his blooded sword at the servants fiercely. Obediently, they picked up the camel halves and threw them through the opening. The Sultan beamed a very contented smile and returned once more to his goblet of refreshing wine. From his throne of silk cushions, he sat and gloated at what he had achieved. Charlie had now reached the top of the Sultan's parasol, which a servant was dutifully holding. He had no idea what all that activity had been about. He crept back inside his shell and once more pulled out the lettuce leaf as shelter from the deadly sun. What a very strange experience! Charlie's adventure was opening up all sorts of questions. More questions, which he stored away neatly with the others inside his shell. The servants began quickly to decamp, leaving the golden eyelet and the poor dead camel halves behind as a reminder to others that might pass by. Whilst the caravan moved off into the void of the desert once more, Charlie clung to the Sultan's parasol and slept. And I'll be back to read you chapter 4 in just a little bit. Hope you're still enjoying it. See you soon. Welcome back. Okay, it's time for the end of book 1. Time for chapter 4, Wild Men and Hungry Lions. The journey with the Sultan had been rather bumpy across the desert, and a violent sandstorm had started. The strong winds had caught hold of the lettuce leaf again, and Charlie had been tousled by the wind. He finally came to rest at an oasis, a large dense forest in the middle of the desert. He was very relieved to get out of the hot sun and into the refreshing shade of the tall trees. As Charlie drank slowly from the small water spring, cooling down from the dusty journey, a wild-looking man came bounding out of the undergrowth, shouting loudly, "At last! At last! I'm saved!" Charlie drank some more and waited for the wild man to calm down before he spoke. "I'm sorry, sir, but what do you mean?" The wild man looked at Charlie carefully. He walked around him, cocking his head to one side like a parrot as he studied him. Finally the wild man said, "You're not lost as well, are you?" "Lost?" replied Charlie. "I've only just arrived. I was just in the desert." "The desert?" interrupted the wild man. "What desert?" Charlie looked blank. He didn't really know what desert it was. He had just been so relieved to find some shade and cooling water, he hadn't bothered to notice how he came to be in the forest. He simply floated in on the lettuce leaf like a magic carpet. Finally, they had to agree that they were both indeed lost. They decided to walk along together and hopefully they would find their way out. "How long have you been lost?" asked Charlie, wanted to gain some knowledge from this new meeting. "I can't really remember," began the lost man. "It's been so long now I've forgotten. That happens when you're lost. Eventually you forget everything." They both walked along one of the many forest paths in silence. After a while, the lost man spoke again. "Life is much like this forest. Take this path we're on. We walk along it because someone before us walked along it. Probably many others like us have since followed their trail. Maybe too, like us, they didn't know where they were going, but followed it just the same. That's probably the reason it's become so wide." Charlie listened with interest. The lost man had obviously had plenty of time to think about such matters. Perhaps he could learn something from this man to store up in his growing shell with all his other experiences. "Look at this path, for example," the lost man continued. "Can you see those smaller paths? Some are not as easy to spot. See how they lead off to places elsewhere? We don't know where they lead either. What makes us stay on this path? Why don't we follow one of the smaller ones? Or we could set off through the undergrowth where nobody's ever been before and make our own new path. We could do that. They both remained on the large path, both very deep in thought. Charlie's mind was wandering, but he was becoming a little confused with all the new questions. After a time they reached part of the path where a large old oak tree had fallen and stopped them from going any further. "What do we do now?" asked Charlie. "Well," began the lost man, "now we have to make a decision. We have many choices. Go round it, go over it, move it, go back the way we came, or we could just wait here till it rots away. We have many, many choices, so many to choose from." They looked at each other and then stared at the fallen tree. "If only I had a chainsaw," lamented the old man. Charlie looked around. There were many pathways to choose. "It would be so much easier to choose if we knew where these paths led." The lost man looked rather puzzled. "But I know where all these paths lead. I've been lost for so long I must have been up and down all of these paths at least a dozen times." "So where does this path take us?" The lost man scratched his head and stroked his long beard. "Let me think," he said. "This path here leads to a crossroads and then it forks into three smaller paths. The first curves to the left, the middle one leads back to the crossroads and the other leads..." He let his words trail off as he thought about where the paths led to. "But where does it all end up?" The lost man didn't answer. He just looked more confused than ever. In a final attempt to get a straight answer, Charlie asked again, "Where is it you're trying to get to?" "Not really sure," said the lost man woefully. "I just want to be unlost." "If you don't know where you are and you don't know where you want to be, how will you know when you've arrived? Or even if you're headed in the right direction?" The lost man didn't know. This had all become far too tiresome for Charlie. He knew he had a future ahead of him, and he knew he wouldn't find it if he stayed with the lost man. So Charlie politely thanked the old man, said goodbye, and wandered off in search of the desert once more. Charlie stored up the thoughts of his encounter with the lost man inside his ever-growing shell. The path he had chosen led him into a dense jungle. He had been crawling along for what seemed like hours. He had passed many strange creatures, but none had been friendly enough to approach him and talk, or perhaps they had just not seen him. He had no idea where he was, except lost. He was about to despair when he heard a lion up ahead, roaring in pain. Cautiously, Charlie approached, and sure enough, there in the small clearing before him was an enormous lion crying in agony. The large beast had obviously stepped on something very sharp and painful. The lion limped awkwardly, trying to relieve the pain. It stopped pacing occasionally to lick its paw. Charlie watched. There was nothing he could do to help. They both had a problem. This wild, man-eating beast had a large and very painful thorn stuck in its paw, and Charlie was helpless to assist. Thinking about it, Charlie wasn't exactly sure he wanted to help, as the lion looked extremely dangerous. Pacing up and down only caused the lion pain, so it stopped. Instead, it just lay down under a shady tree and cried. The poor creature was obviously in great pain. Charlie just looked on, helplessly. Feeling sad, Charlie turned to leave and was almost knocked down by the swift approach of a young man. He had heard the impassioned plea of the lion and had come to help. Charlie decided to stay and watch and see what happened. The young man stared cautiously at the ferocious beast, who still roared out in pain. The man neared the lion slowly, uttering soft words of comfort. The injured lion growled, but offered up his paw for closer inspection. Now Charlie could see the large thorn which had embedded itself into the soft flesh between its toes. Still comforting the beast, the man took its paw and slowly began to pull at the thorn. Charlie watched eagerly from a safe distance. He was relieved that the man had come to help where he could not. The lion let out an angry wail as the man struggled with the thorn. It would not budge. He tried and tried, but to no avail. The man sat down and rested, his brow pearled with sweat. The lion licked its paw and whined a plea of help. The man wiped his brow and set about his work again. In one final attempt, the man pulled violently at the obstruction. The lion roared more loudly than ever. With a final tug, the thorn came free. This caused the lion so much pain that it instinctively lashed out at the man, spreading him to the ground like jam, dead. Charlie stared in disbelief at what the inconsiderate beast had done. But rather than be ashamed of what it had just done, the lion licked its mended paw, then licked its lips, remembered it was hungry, and began to eat the very opportune meal lying on the forest floor before it. Charlie stared in total disbelief. Thank goodness he hadn't tried to help. It was only after the lion had eaten its fill of the dead man and paced back into the depths of the jungle that Charlie felt it safe to leave. He certainly didn't fancy being made into the lion's dessert. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this story so far, but this is where it ends for now. To discover what happens to Charlie next, you'll have to wait until the second book of his adventures. Who will he meet next? What exciting things will he see? What exotic places and strange new lands will he discover? I wonder if you can work out where he'll go next. Perhaps you can talk about what his new adventures might be, or even write your own story about what happens next. Maybe you could draw some pictures. I've got a website you can put them up on. The only clue I can give you is that Charlie's adventures are only just beginning. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please leave me a comment somewhere below. I'm going to put this up on YouTube in just a minute, and if you did like it, I will make some time and I will read you book 2. Alright everybody, stay safe out there. Hopefully we'll all get through this together. The NHS, all the emergency services, all of the staff are doing a marvellous job to help with this epidemic that we're all going through globally. But tough times, but we'll get through it. So hopefully I will see you soon for book 2, and maybe I'll read you some of my other stories as well. So goodbye for now. Good night.